In the North Atlantic between Scotland and Iceland, the Faroe Islands rise from the sea as 18 steep pieces of land. From a distance, the landscape can look almost impossible to inhabit. Mountains fall toward narrow villages, roads disappear into dark rock, and cliffs rise so sharply that the ocean seems to begin where the land ends. On the northern island of Eysturoy, the sea cliffs of Enniberg rise about 700 meters above the water, close to 2,300 feet. But living in the Faroe Islands is not experienced from the edge of a cliff. It begins much closer at a front door before sunrise, in a car leaving a small village, at a harbor, where the wind changes the surface of the water, and on the routes that connect one community to another. The real question is not how people survive beneath such dramatic geography. It is how ordinary life becomes possible when sea mountains wind and weather are always part of the journey. To understand that, we have to follow daily life from the places where people actually live. Before the upper slopes are fully visible, a few windows begin to glow beside a fjord. A resident steps outside, checks the conditions almost without thinking, and crosses wet pavement toward a parked car. Somewhere closer to the water, an engine starts at the harbor. A light comes on in a workshop. Another vehicle moves through the village and disappears around the mountain. Nothing about these actions is unusual. That is exactly why they matter. The archipelago stretches a little more than 100 kilometers from north to south, but distance here is not measured only in kilometers. Two settlements can appear close on a map and still be separated by a mountain, a fjord, or open water. A village may be visible across a narrow sound, yet reaching it can require a tunnel, a ferry, or a road that curves around the shape of the land. The terrain explains why settlements take the forms they do. Flat land is limited, so houses gather where the landscape gives them room around sheltered bays, along narrow coastal strips, and at the heads of fjords, where the slopes briefly become gentler. In some places, a village seems pressed between mountain and sea, with homes, roads, a harbor, a church, and public buildings sharing the same small area of usable ground. From high above, these communities can look fragile beneath the scale of the mountains. At street level, the impression changes. Cars are parked beside houses. Delivery vehicles stop near shops. Children leave for school. Boats move through protected water. Workshops open, buses continue along the coast, and people carry out the same small tasks that begin a working day almost anywhere. The mountains remain enormous, but the scale of life is human. That contrast is essential to understanding the islands. The landscape may dominate photographs, but residents experience it through practical consequences. A slope determines where a road can go. A fjord affects the shape of a journey. Strong wind can change work at sea, while low cloud can make a familiar road feel different from one hour to the next. Geography becomes personal when it changes what time someone leaves home, which route they take, or whether a journey happens at all. A morning drive from a small village can begin quietly. The road follows the water, passing houses and fields before the settlement falls behind. Someone who uses the route regularly may know every curve, every exposed section, and every place where fog tends to gather. What feels dramatic to a first-time visitor becomes a learned sequence through repetition. Weather makes that knowledge more important. The Faroes have a cool oceanic climate with relatively mild winters for their northern latitude and cool summers. Yet, temperature alone says little about how a day feels. Wind, rain, fog, and rapidly changing visibility often matter more to movement. A road can be clear at one end of a tunnel and wet at the other. A ridge can disappear behind cloud, while the lower village remains visible. Sunlight may reach one side of a fjord, while the opposite slope stays gray. At a harbor, the water close to the quay may be calm, while stronger wind is already moving through the channel beyond. People build flexibility around these changes. Someone preparing to travel may look at the forecast or road conditions before leaving. A worker outside may begin a task knowing that the wind could decide when it ends. A family planning a ferry journey may leave room for the possibility that the timetable changes. These are not dramatic acts of endurance. They are ordinary forms of judgment, repeated often enough to become habit. Life here is sometimes described from the outside as if every day were a confrontation between people and nature. That misses something important. Residents do not wake each morning surprised that the islands are windy or mountainous. Familiarity changes the relationship. People learn which conditions require caution, which routes are more exposed, and when a plan needs to remain flexible. That knowledge is one of the invisible systems supporting everyday life. The most visible system is transport. For generations, mountains and water controlled how directly communities could reach one another. Roads reduced some of those barriers, and mountain tunnels changed them further by allowing traffic to pass through rock rather than climb exposed routes or stop at the end of a valley. Eventually, the same idea went beneath the sea. Today, 4 subsea road tunnels connect major parts of the archipelago. For a driver, the experience is almost the opposite of the landscape above. A journey may begin beside open water and steep green slopes before narrowing suddenly toward a tunnel entrance. The wind disappears, the rain is left outside, and artificial light replaces the changing sky. For several minutes, the world becomes road markings, concrete engine noise, and the steady rhythm of tires. Then daylight returns. The striking part is how quickly this can become routine. The Eysturoy tunnel makes that especially clear. Its road network passes beneath the seabed and divides at a roundabout underground. To someone seeing it for the first time, the idea of choosing a road beneath the North Atlantic can feel extraordinary. For people who travel through it regularly, its deeper significance is measured in minutes saved. Before, the tunnel journeys between parts of Eysturoy and the capital could require a much longer road around the fjords. The new connection dramatically shortened those routes. That changes more than a journey on a map. A worker can consider employment farther from home. A medical appointment becomes easier to fit into the day. Families can visit more easily. Businesses can move people and goods with less time spent in transit. An evening activity in another town may no longer feel like an undertaking. Infrastructure begins to influence choices about where people can reasonably live, work, study, shop, or maintain relationships. The mountains have not become smaller, and the channels between islands have not narrowed. What has changed is the amount of control those barriers have over the clock. Sandoy offers another example of how quickly daily life can change when a connection changes. Until the Sandoy Tunnel opened in December 2023, vehicles traveling between Sandoy and the Central Road Network relied on a ferry crossing. The journey therefore included more than driving. It involved reaching the quay, fitting the trip around a sailing, crossing the water, and continuing after arrival. Now the route can remain a road from beginning to end. A resident can leave a village on Sandoy, drive toward the tunnel, descend beneath the seabed, and emerge on Streymoy before continuing toward Tórshavn or elsewhere in the connected road network. The island itself has not moved. Its villages, fields, slopes, and coastline remain where they were. But the practical meaning of living there has changed. A person no longer needs a ferry departure to determine when that particular road journey begins. Someone returning late in the day does not have to calculate the trip around the same crossing. A business can think differently about deliveries. Families gain more freedom over when they travel. This is where geography becomes social. The importance of a tunnel cannot be understood only through engineering statistics. Its effects eventually appear in ordinary decisions: which job feels reachable, whether an appointment can fit between other responsibilities, how often relatives visit, and whether living on one island still feels compatible with spending much of the day on another. A place can remain visually remote while becoming much less isolated in practice. Yet this experience is not shared equally across the archipelago. Beyond the connected road system, the sea still has a direct role in the timetable. Public ferries remain essential for communities beyond the main road network. At a small quay, travel follows a different rhythm. People arrive before the boat leaves. A vehicle may wait near the loading area while passengers carry shopping bags or work equipment toward the vessel. The crew prepares the crossing, and the engine begins to vibrate through the deck. Once the ferry leaves the harbor, the village stays visible for a while. Houses gather along the lower slope, and the road ends near the water. As the boat moves farther out, the headland begins to hide the settlement, and the separation between islands becomes physical again. Inside the cabin, the experience can be completely ordinary. People sit with phones, groceries, luggage, or equipment needed on the other side. Some stay indoors away from the wind, while others step outside when conditions allow. The significance of the journey is not that it happens on a boat. It is that the boat gives structure to the day. Someone connected entirely by road usually has more freedom to decide exactly when to leave. A resident relying on a ferry has a departure time and a return connection to consider. Weather can add another layer of uncertainty. A work shift appointment, shopping trip, or family visit may therefore be planned with both directions in mind. This produces several versions of island life within the same country. Someone living near the capital can cross between major islands using roads and tunnels without boarding a ferry. Another resident may still organize essential journeys around a boat. Neither experience represents the entire Faroe Islands. Together, they show how differently geography can shape routine depending on where someone lives. The sea that separates communities is also one of the main foundations of Faroe's work. Fisheries and aquaculture remain central to the economy, and their importance becomes visible long before anyone looks at export statistics. It can be seen around working harbors, where the sea is not a background, but part of the working environment. A harbor at the beginning of the day has a rhythm built around preparation. Equipment is moved, lines are handled, decks are cleaned, vehicles cross wet concrete, and doors open at workshops or storage buildings. The surrounding mountains may create an extraordinary setting, but the work depends on repetition and precision. Modern fishing is not simply an old tradition preserved for appearance. It operates through a technical system of vessels, regulations, safety procedures, processing logistics, maintenance, and international trade. The boat itself is only one part of that system. When a vessel returns, the sequence of work continues on land. Lines are secured, equipment is moved, products are transferred, trucks arrive, and another stage of the process begins. Harbors link activity at sea with processing, transport, storage, repair, administration, and export. Fish and fish products account for the overwhelming majority of Faroe's goods. Exports and aquaculture has become a major part of that maritime economy. At ground level, however, the meaning of those numbers is more immediate. The maritime economy supports jobs and businesses in communities where mountains may make the town look enclosed, even while its economic relationships extend far beyond the islands. Klaksvík illustrates this clearly. The country's second-largest town sits among the northern islands, with steep mountains surrounding a harbor strongly associated with fishing and maritime activity. Homes, roads, vessels, workshops, industrial buildings, and services share the narrow space around the water. From above, Klaksvík can appear contained by the landscape. At ground level, much of its movement points outward. Aquaculture adds another modern layer to the relationship between land and sea. In sheltered fjords, salmon farms form controlled patterns on water that otherwise appears completely natural. Service vessels move between them, while feed monitoring, fish, health maintenance, processing, and transport connect what happens offshore with facilities and markets far beyond the fjord. This helps explain why visual remoteness can be misleading. Someone can work in a place surrounded by steep slopes and open Atlantic water while participating in a highly international industry. A truck leaving a small coastal community can enter a tunnel, cross several islands by road, and become part of a supply chain extending far beyond the Faroes. The same connection appears in less visible forms. Digital communications allow businesses and households to operate across physical distance. Roads and ferries move supplies between communities. Public transport links islands where populations can be very small. The practical systems of modern life overlap with a landscape that still looks wild enough to suggest isolation. That is one of the central contradictions of the Faroes. The islands remain physically fragmented, yet many parts of daily life are highly connected. Remoteness here is not simply the absence of access. It is the continuous work of maintaining access across difficult terrain. Tórshavn shows the other end of that scale. The capital contains around 2/5 of the Faroese population and concentrates many of the country's services, workplaces, educational activities, cultural institutions, shops, and public functions. Streets rise quickly from the waterfront, and the harbor remains close even in the more urban parts of the city. Older and newer versions of the capital sit almost beside one another. In the historic area of rainy, black-tarred wooden houses with grass roofs line narrow streets, and some of these old buildings are still used as homes. Nearby modern neighborhoods, offices, shops, schools, restaurants, and traffic show a capital fully involved in contemporary life. What makes Tórshavn useful for understanding the country is not its size. By international standards, it remains a very small capital. Its importance comes from concentration. A resident from a smaller community may travel there for work, education, shopping, an appointment, an event, or access to services that are not available at the same scale elsewhere. At the same time, people who live in the capital travel outward every day toward other communities. The movement goes in both directions. This prevents the country from fitting a simple story in which Tórshavn represents modern life, while the villages represent isolation. Roads, buses, tunnels, ferries, communications, family relationships, and employment continually move people between those different settings. Someone can spend the morning in an office near the capital and return later to a village beneath a mountain. Another person may begin the day near a small harbor and reach Tórshavn before much of the working morning has passed. What changes is not whether one place is modern and another traditional. What changes is how much transport lies between the front door and the destination. Homes reveal a quieter part of the same adaptation. Traditional black-tarred timber buildings and turf roofs have become some of the most recognizable images of Faroese architecture, particularly in older areas. Across the islands, these forms exist alongside modern homes, designed for contemporary daily life. From outside, a house can appear completely exposed to its surroundings. Wind reaches the walls, rain moves against the windows, and the mountain behind may fill almost the entire view. Inside, everything becomes smaller and more familiar. Wet clothes need somewhere to dry. Shoes collect near the entrance. Food is prepared. Phones charge. Someone looks at the weather for the following morning. Schoolwork gets finished, messages arrive, and plans are made for another working day. These details correct one of the distortions created by aerial photography. From high above, people almost disappear. Roads become narrow lines, and villages shrink into clusters of roofs surrounded by enormous slopes. At household level, the islands are full of routine. People shop, work, study, repair things, cook, drive, visit, relatives attend activities, keep appointments, and think about what needs to happen tomorrow. The landscape remains present, but it is not the only thing defining life. Small communities also bring their own practical questions. A village may have fewer local services, and specialized needs may require travel to a larger town. Employment opportunities differ from place to place. Education can pull young people toward the capital or beyond the islands for a period of time. This is why no single village can represent the Faroes' experience. Each community has its own relationship with jobs, transport services, population, and distance. Modern connectivity gives people more options for managing those differences without necessarily leaving the place they call home. In a small settlement, a single service can carry more weight than its physical size suggests. A shop is not only a shop if the next alternative is far away. A school matters differently when the local population is small. A harbor may support work transport deliveries and everyday movement through the same few streets. A reliable road or ferry connection can influence whether living in a community remains practical for families whose work or services are located elsewhere. The Faroes government itself describes transport telecommunications, high-speed internet roads, tunnels, and ferry connections as important to the economic, social, and cultural viability of communities around the islands. That does not make small community life automatically easy. Some jobs remain concentrated in larger towns. Specialized services still require travel. Young people may leave for education or work and later decide whether to return. Housing and employment opportunities vary. What connectivity changes is the number of possible answers. A person can live in one place and work in another. A family can remain in a smaller community while regularly using services in Tórshavn. A business can operate far from the capital while depending on digital communications and transport connections that reach the rest of the country. This is also why asking simply why people stay can produce an overly simple answer. There is no single reason shared by every resident. What can be observed more safely are the conditions that make staying possible: access, employment, housing, transport, communications, schools, services, and relationships that can be maintained across distance. Over time, the practical becomes emotional. A harbor matters because people have used it repeatedly. A road becomes familiar because it leads to work, school, family, and home. Weather is remembered through specific places: the wind at one bend, fog on one mountain, rain on one window. Belonging is difficult to measure. Routine gives it a physical shape. By afternoon, weather can rewrite the appearance of the islands again. A village that was clear in the morning may sit beneath low cloud. Rain darkens the road, and water begins to show on steep slopes. At the harbor, the surface changes as stronger gusts move through the fjord. For someone living here, this is less spectacle than information. Visibility affects driving. Wind influences work around exposed water. Ferry updates can determine whether a journey continues as planned. Outdoor tasks may be shortened or delayed. Most of these adjustments are small enough to escape attention. That is precisely why they matter. Living in a place shaped so strongly by geography does not require constant dramatic acts of resilience. More often, it requires practical flexibility. People check conditions, adjust plans, and continue when the situation allows. Success rarely looks spectacular. It looks like the ferry arriving, the road remaining open, a delivery reaching the village, someone getting to work, and someone else getting home. Ordinary life is the outcome. Late in the day, the transport system begins carrying many of those movements in the opposite direction. Cars return through tunnels. Buses move back towards smaller communities. Work vessels approach their harbors. At a ferry terminal, people wait for the crossing home. As a ferry approaches an island, the destination gradually changes scale. What first appears as a small group of shapes beneath a mountain becomes a recognizable village. Individual houses emerge, the quay separates from the shoreline, and waiting vehicles become visible. The boat slows and reaches the harbor. Passengers continue onto land, and vehicles move onto the road toward homes beyond the quay. There is nothing exceptional about the arrival. That is what makes it such a useful image of island life. Tomorrow, the same connection has to work again. A tunnel matters because thousands of ordinary journeys follow its opening. A ferry matters because it continues to depart and return. A harbor matters because work continues after the most beautiful light has disappeared. A road matters because it remains usable through changing seasons. The archipelago is not held together by a single spectacular piece of engineering. It is held together by systems that function repeatedly. As evening settles, the scale of the landscape changes again. Lights appear in windows beside dark water. Street lamps reflect on wet pavement, and the mountains lose detail until they become large shapes behind the houses. Harbors grow quieter, though an engine may still carry across the fjord. Inside, attention returns to ordinary questions. What time does tomorrow begin? What is the weather doing? Is the ferry operating normally? How long will the drive take? Can work, school appointments, and family responsibilities fit into the same day? This is where the title of the story becomes more meaningful. Living beneath sea cliffs that rise thousands of feet above the Atlantic does not mean thinking about cliffs every morning. It means learning what their geography requires. A visitor may remember the view. A resident remembers the route, the timing, the exposed section of road, the harbor in stronger wind, and the connection that has to work again tomorrow. The dramatic becomes practical knowledge. That may be the clearest difference between seeing the Faroe Islands and living in them. The cliffs remain. Enniberg still rises roughly 700 meters above the North Atlantic. Mountains still descend steeply toward settlements. Fog still hides upper slopes, wind still changes plans, and several communities remain beyond the road network. Modern infrastructure has not made geography disappear. It has changed the relationship people have with it. A mountain can block the direct route while a tunnel carries the road through it. Water can divide two islands, while a subsea connection turns the crossing into part of a commute. Elsewhere, a ferry gives distance a schedule that people can organize around. Work follows the same pattern. The ocean is changeable, but harbors, vessels processing logistics, and experience turn it into livelihood. Weather remains uncertain, while forecasts and local knowledge help people decide when to move and when to wait. Life here is not a story about conquering the North Atlantic. It is about understanding how much flexibility the North Atlantic still requires. At night, the archipelago looks divided again. One village becomes a cluster of lights beside the water. Another lies across a fjord, while another is hidden completely behind a mountain. From a distance, each community can appear almost separate from the next. But the connections remain even when they cannot be seen. Roads continue through the darkness. Tunnels pass through mountains and beneath the sea. Ferries wait at quays for another day of crossings. Fishing vessels sit in harbor before the next working cycle begins. Inside, homes, people make plans that depend on all of these systems functioning again tomorrow. That may be the clearest way to understand living in the Faroe Islands. The geography is extraordinary because it refuses to disappear from view. The achievement of daily life is quieter. People have built routes through the barriers, schedules around uncertainty, and communities within the narrow spaces the land provides. They have not made the islands less remote. They have made remoteness workable enough to become home. If you want to continue exploring how people build ordinary lives in extraordinary places, continue with the next documentary from Best Hidden Places.